Well, it is a wonderful Monday here in New Hampshire. How about you, Kelly?
Beautiful day in Southern California, 70 degrees, not a cloud in the sky.
Nice. It is gorgeous here. We think when it hits 80 on Thursday, it just might be the end of the snow that is still all over my backyard because we are finally into spring. But we are joined here today by three authors, co-authors of Critical Comprehension. Lester Laminack, who needs no introduction, although you have certainly established such a beautiful way of being with books and with kids. And I appreciate that, having seen you in action so many times. And Katie Kelly, you are still at Furman University, correct?
I am.
And the co-author of Reading Makes a Difference with Lester, Reading to Make a Difference. And then Vivian, you are at American University working with the early childhood program now, which I think is fabulous, because is there anything more distressing than the current reading war? I don't know, reignited ridiculous thing that's happening. Like, why would we be at war over reading? But since it's happening,
Right.
I'm glad that you are there talking to new people in the fields of early childhood and working with young people, but also this book. Because I told Lester and Katie, who I've known forever, that I bought one for my daughter who's teaching fifth grade in Chelsea, and she never believed she'd have kids. Who she, wanted to be this middle grades teacher, didn't think she'd have kids who didn't know how to read, and she does. Right? She started teaching the year everybody shut down for COVID, so she's never had a non-COVID year till this year. And so we have a book club every other week where we're reading your book. And then she's trying things out, which I think is just awesome. And I'm really excited to talk with people about it. And the first thing I hope one of you will answer is the title, because I think we think of comprehension as just understanding. What is it? What is critical comprehension?
So I think I'll start, and maybe, Lester and Katie can jump in at any moment, please. So I think probably the first thing people need to know is that with this critical comprehension framework that we've created, that we acknowledge that reading and writing are never neutral and are therefore shaped by our ideologies and beliefs. So no text is ever neutral, and all texts then are socially constructed from particular ideologies and beliefs. Since texts are socially constructed, they can be deconstructed and reconstructed to put on offer counter narratives that disrupt problematic notions in the original text. So the framework is really an approach, a way of thinking that creates space for deeper, thoughtful, and thought-provoking readings of text, and not just books, but music is text, ads is text, the web is text, movies is text, and so forth. It's a way of working with these texts that moves us beyond the passive acceptance of text and literal levels of meaning to question the word and the world at the same time. And I think, it matters because now more than ever, children are surrounded by diverse texts in and outside of school. I mean, it's just all around them. And these texts come from pretty convincing and powerful sources. And so children need to be able to navigate those texts in ways that ensure that they aren't duped by them, and that they make informed decisions about, what to take away from these texts, what to leave behind, what to advocate for, what to use, what to come away with to contribute to make the world a better place in a way that makes sense for them. I'll let Lester and Katie jump in here and take up all of it.
I think I would add to what Vivian said so eloquently is that, children deserve more than teaching to pass a test or teaching to find the right answer, that the teacher is the power holder and, the one who's determining what that right answer is. And frankly, I think they determine, a better education and curriculum beyond a narrow whitewash curriculum that we often see. And to provide maybe a little context personally for me, admittedly, I was in my 30s, going to graduate school for the second time, getting my PhD, before I ever learned to read critically. And we write about this in the book. You know, many of us experience learning to read as this kind of dump truck, right? Filling the dump truck with the answers and then regurgitating them for the teacher. And I was just kind of dumbfounded, like, wait a minute, for all these years, how much have I missed? There's so much that I'm wondering that I want to learn more. And of course, at that time, I'm reading Vivian's work, and I'm so inspired by the way in which she helps like preschoolers and kindergartners do this kind of critical thinking to question not only who is this story about, whose voice is included, but whose voices aren't included, and what might they contribute, and how might that help us weave a more complete tapestry of truth. And so I think part of critical comprehension is you have to be able to read with the text to understand those dominant narratives and messages, but you have to also be able to read against it to really question and interrogate, like, what's there, what's not there, and why, right? Like, who's benefiting from this? And I think once we start doing that, and hopefully it's before you're in your 30s like me, which is why I know I really wanted to write this book. This is a book I wish I had when I was teaching elementary school. Once you start thinking in these ways, once you become critically conscious, you don't stop. It's not just like a one and done lesson. Okay, now we're going to do this. It's just a way of seeing the world and thinking.
Mm.
Yeah, I would layer on top of what they're saying that one thing we all have to be conscious of as we try to help lead people to thinking this way is that the majority of people who are already in the teaching force did not come through an education that prepared them to read things with critical comprehension.
Mm-hmm.
Katie made the allusion to the dump truck, the idea that most people who are already out in the world and out of school, for them, comprehension was giving the right answers to someone else's question and not ever questioning who wrote something. And, you think about for generations, when my parents, my mom is deceased, but my dad is 90, when they were young people, if you read it in the newspaper, it was the absolute truth.
Mm-hmm.
In my generation, the black and white television, if Walter Cronkite gave it on the evening news, if you had it on a newscast, it was true. In this generation, if they see it on an iPad, if they can find it on the internet, it's their truth. And each generation has a source of truth. And if you learn to take that truth and believe that it's the only truth without questioning or pushing back or checking against a different source, then comprehension becomes really, really narrow. And you made reference to the reading wars. Well, in addition to the reading wars, we're also pushing right now against things like people trying to narrow what children have access to read. And, that is only the tip of an iceberg. When they're successful with that, they'll narrow what's available in bookstores, and then they will narrow what's available from publishers. And that's an attempt to reduce the ability to read with critical comprehension. So all of that, I think, going back to what Vivian and Katie have already said, that this work can't happen until teachers do it first. Mm-hmm. And so teachers are going to have that epiphany, like Katie was saying, she was in her 30s before it happened. And, before she began to have that insight, we need to take the time to begin to look at something and question. And we hope that the guides we provide with the lessons, the questions that we set up in the framework, would also be tried out by teachers. Like, let me do this. Let me try this before I run into a classroom and say, what do you think? So that I can have that epiphanal moment on my own.
And the book came about after Katie and Lester reached out to me and sort of asked the question, well, why isn't there more critical literacy work going on in classrooms? And then they shared that they'd been thinking about, comprehension in terms of critical literacy and what some possible intersections may be. And so, I mean, there was no question that I was going to do this with them because it would just created such an incredible space, and one that already existed, one that already exists in all literacy curricula, one that we didn't have to create. I mean, it was already there, ready made for us to work through. And I think that's why we tried to make this framework as accessible as possible within existing comprehension spaces, and sort of reframing comprehension from a critical literacy orientation, and then, you know, creating the three moves sort of just made it a little bit easier and we hope accessible to as many teachers as possible.
Can you share the three moves with us?
Well, I have to say too, before, as you jump into that, that the three moves that are shown again and again in this book are shown through picture books that many people may not have in their classrooms. And I think that was one of the first things that really excited and surprised me, was I was flipping through finding all these books I had bought for my granddaughter's library that I so often did not see in other people's libraries, right? I Am Every Good Thing. That is an amazing book. I love The Proudest Blue. And so even beyond try these things out, this book is an introduction to really vibrant texts that will be useful across many different grade levels. And I had asked you guys to think about The Proudest Blue because the first read is called the movie read. And I have to tell you, at our first book club meeting, my daughter said to me, I have never done that. I have never just read them the book before I started asking questions. And I was like, oh, because she loves to gather them all at the rug and read one of her, she has an enormous library of picture books. But she said, wow, I have to try that. And so the next piece that occurred to me is my favorite moment with Lester was when he was doing a keynote and he said someone had said to him, I'm not good at read aloud. And he said, well, you have to get good at it because it's your job. I mean, it was so obvious. Like, you can't just say, well, I'm not good at that. This is essential. And so we had asked Lester to read us a little bit in his movie read. and tell us, like, what's the purpose of the movie read? Why have that?
Okay, the movie read, I first played with several years ago, and when I put together a project for Scholastic called the Best Friends Collection. And the idea was, if you know 5 or 10 books really, really well, inside and out, you can teach anything all year long. And your kids would have a point of reference to go back to, so that if I said to you, do you remember the scene in Peter's chair where he starts packing up all the things to run away? And he puts in a dog biscuit? What does that show us about Peter? You know, the last time we read this book, we explored what we know about Peter. And we used these words. Peter's the kind of boy who, and we know because in the book we saw, well, somehow we missed that. So how do we know what that is? I don't have to stop and read the book. I can just, if I'm sitting down with some writers and we're developing character, I can say, how did Ezra Jack Keats help us know Peter? And that book is written for kindergartners, and they can easily pull those scenes up if you've read the book numerous times. And so the very first read, I was arguing, should be one that's uninterrupted, that we don't stop and talk about it, that we don't raise questions, that we don't share with our neighbors, that we don't make little notes. You just like go to the movies. You walk in, you sit down, you watch the movie. And if you do talk, which I'm prone to do, the person next to me will go, shh, you know, like, don't talk in the movie. You wait till you're outside. And then there's this flood of conversation. And then you realize, wow, I must have missed that. I don't remember seeing it. What I'm hoping for is that every kid would begin to learn that each of us pays attention to something different, which reveals one of the things that we get at later in this book is the notion of your own biases, your own set of perspectives shape what you attend to and what you miss. And by interacting with each other after the read, you kind of have a new set of lenses of, I'm going to go back and look at that. I don't think you're right.
Mhm.
And then you begin to realize, wow, it's in there, but I missed it because you have a lens that I don't have. So then the second reads and the third reads, that we're doing here build sort of on different things than when I did that collection. But the movie read comes from that notion of just read it, start to finish, don't stop, let the reader, listener get the gestalt of it, and then go back to it with that full knowledge of what's taking place. And the thing I've argued with teachers who want to stop and turn and talk and chat in the first read is there is nothing in the second read that you cannot do that can be done in the first read other than make predictions. I mean, you can't predict in the second read, but you do all the other things. So if prediction is an issue, then, go have a small group and do prediction. You don't have to do that in every book. You're going to do it anyway.
I love that sense of the wholeness of it first. The movie.
Yeah.
You don't talk during a movie. I love that.
Mhm.
Wish we did that more with novels in the middle and high schools.
Well, we did, Penny, in a way, because Penny and I advocated for in our last two books that we got to stop going chapter by chapter by chapter by chapter and let kids run out ahead of us. And what's really fascinating listening to the three of you for me is that your book is marketed K6, but every single thing you have said since the top of this, I would go and use what you're doing in a 12th grade class tomorrow, right? Including the picture books.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I just think I'm just stunned by how beautiful it is for older kids as well.
And to Lester's point he made earlier, I mean, we need to do this work with adults too, and we probably need to start there. So I'm doing a lot of these lessons in my classes here at Furman with pre-service teachers and in-service teachers, and the conversation is rich and nuanced, and they are developing that critical lens. So Kelly, yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think this work could and should be done with everybody of all ages.
And I think one of the interesting things that happened while we were writing this book is sort of the sharing of instances of doing this kind of work. So for instance, in my situation, I work mostly with very young children. So, some of the very same things I've done with 3 to 5 year olds. And, so it's sort of from 3 to 5 year olds all the way up into, I've used the same strategies with doctoral students. So, it's really a way of thinking, a way of being, a way of engaging with texts.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you're starting K1, 2, 3. Like, I just love that. I know Penny and I always love it when a third grade teacher comes up and says she's taken one of our ideas. And I just love the fact that you're teaching kids deeper reading and right out of the gate.
Yeah, and the second move, that reading with the text, has nuances that I haven't heard before. Does anyone want to talk about what that is? Who's it going to be?
Katie, go.
Oh, I think Katie.
All right, Katie.
So when we think about reading with the text, I see this, I think we see this as kind of your most common lens, the common comprehension work that's happening in the classrooms, probably the most standards-based, although critical comprehension is standards-based too. But this is really, looking at the dominant messages in the text, the common understandings, the summarizing, the inferring, looking at point of view or perspective, and really making sure, Vivian mentioned this in a previous conversation we were having, kids, it's hard to do that critical read, to read against the text if you haven't read with the text. So you really have to have that initial understanding, right? Like you have to have that literal understanding, the inferential level kind of thinking that goes with the text before you can start really disrupting and deconstructing it. You have to understand what it is. You have to know what that surface is before you can dig deeper below the surface. So it's that initial step of understanding, who are the characters? What is the setting? What's the plot? What am I thinking about this? How does this connect? And maybe as Lester was pointing out, some of those conversations around perspectives and the biases that we may bring. Oftentimes with young kids, we talk about connections. This is the way in which, this story is reminding me of something else I've read or experienced in my life. And then, thinking about somebody else, this notion of Louise Rosenblatt's work with, we all interact with a text in different ways. And so when we each make our own meaning and have these conversations, we have deeper understanding. And that's really, really important. But that's not quite yet that critical comprehension work. That's got to be first.
But even with those first two reads, you've added these nuances that I don't think we have thought enough about as a profession. And the range of texts in this book is from everyday picture books to The Hill We Climb, Amanda Gorman, right? That's something that people are using in middle and high school. So it's actually learning a pattern of instructional practices that we could apply again and again to a new poem, to the beginning of reading a novel together or a play. So the critical reading, now here's where it takes the shift that I have seen almost nowhere, is this idea of what is the third lap? And this is with the same book or the same text. Should I call on somebody?
Vivian.
We're so
Katie, I was wondering, well, Katie, do you want to share a little bit about how you might do that within the context of?
Yeah.
A
Do you
book?
want us to give
That
an
would be-
example maybe that might?
Sure.
Yeah.
So Penny, you mentioned The Proudest Blue,
Hmm.
and for those who may not be, I'm looking over here because I have it here. For those who may not be familiar with the book, it's about two little girls who are going to school on the first day, and the older sister, it is her first day to wear the hijab, and there's so much excitement and pride surrounding this moment, and the little sister, hence the proudest blue, she wears a blue hijab. Little sister looks up to big sister, and at one point in the story, a child teases her, the big sister, for wearing a hijab. And so, if I was reading a book like The Proudest Blue with kids, and I'm thinking about, this second read, I think you could have start with some entry point conversations around, okay, if we're unfamiliar with a hijab, what is a hijab? Who wears a hijab? What does it mean, right? So these are maybe some entry points, and then maybe moving into this notion of the mom's voice is always throughout the book, and she's reminding them to always be their truest selves. So, thinking about the theme, mom says, some people won't understand your hijab, but if you understand who you are, one day they will too. Right. So what does it mean to be your truest self? And I think that we could apply some of that, whether you're a child who wears a hijab or not, right? What does that mean for you? What does that look like? You might also think about the bond between the two sisters is really strong. And the language in the book, the use of similes and metaphors, and they compare the blue hijab to the sky and the ocean, and they say how the sisters are there like the ocean and the sky with no line between them. It is just absolutely beautiful. So you could, talk about the bond, the relationship between people. You can talk about author's craft. You might talk about blue as a symbol for unity and connection and continuity. I just think there's so many conversations you can have there. And then obviously, well, I say obviously, but with the child who teases her, that is a really strong entry point for getting into what I would argue a little more critical comprehension, to talk about the notion of othering. How can we push this conversation beyond saying things like, oh, was that nice? No, that wasn't nice for him. You need to apologize. No. How can we help children to understand ideas around things like calling in and calling out? And what do you do if you might be a bystander and you overhear, you're a kid on that playground that day? And let's be honest, these things happen, right? So I think, it works really well to help children not only understand text, but understand the world around them. So how can we use this book as a springboard to really critically talk about who we are and how we want to be treated and how we should treat others. In fact, so I work in a lot of local schools, and a lot of our alum, I could still go in their classrooms, and I was working with one of the alum who's a 5th grade teacher who's featured in the book, actually. And he was reading this book to his 5th grade class. And before he even opened the book, one of the kids, 5th graders, these are bigger kids, yells, "Oh, what the heck is on her head?" And he starts laughing before they even start reading, right? And so, the teacher was really intentional here to pull back and allow the kids to engage in conversations here. And they called that their peer out for the harm that kind of a comment could cause. And so, that couldn't have happened had this teacher not had all the previous conversations, critical conversations in the books that led up to this, because there was trust that was built. There was a lot of vulnerability between both the students and the teacher, right? That, even the teacher models how he makes mistakes and grows from them. So that's an example of how one teacher actually went right into the critical conversation before they even read the book, because the need to really discuss this notion of othering. So I think all of that to say that we have to be responsive. We have to be responsive to students' needs. So even though we outline these multiple reads with open-ended questions to guide these conversations and this process, I think we have to follow kids and where they are and set them up to not only understand the text and to be critically conscious of that, but also to bring that into the world, into their everyday worlds.
Yeah, and then as part of that third read, that critical read, I mean, you can do all kinds of different things as you think about, now that we know, what can we do with what we know, right? And so borrowing from Roselle and Paul's work on artifactual literacies, for instance, as a part of reading for action, children, younger children, older children, adults could be invited to, let's say, curate a classroom museum of artifacts that include photos or objects, what have you, that represent what's important to know about them. And when I've done this with children, I've found it's really helped them to get beyond surface understanding of one another, to sort of discover connections that weren't immediately visible to them, to grow in respect for one another's ways of being and thinking. The museum can then be, visited by children from other classrooms. They could even create an online space that moves beyond the confines of the school, so that other children in other spaces could visit their curated museum. I'm currently working with a former school principal who engaged in this kind of work with the teachers and students at the school where she was working on a school-wide basis, which was incredible to me. And one of the things that they did was to create school posters. So they deconstructed existing school posters. So they did, the moves that we're talking about in our book. And then in the end, they created new school posters and focused on different things that they were advocating for, and put those up all around the school. I mean, there's so many things. You can do classroom-based or school-wide portrait galleries. Peggy Alberts does this kind of work where students are asked to create images of themselves using a medium that makes sense for them and that represents who they are, and incorporating things from their culture, from their homes. I mean, when you look at the book we're talking about here, children can even create their version of the proudest blue book cover that represents, their proud moment. And those could be, put on offer and shared and displayed around the school and so forth. So there's so many different things that can be done. Once you get going, it's sort of one thing leads to the next things. And these kinds of actions really shift the narrative, shift existing problematic narratives. So, rather than going along with how others define you, this work is really about sorting out how you choose to define yourself and how you choose to represent you, finding ways to make that accessible to others as well.
It's so interesting because early on in your book, you have charts like this one. I want my classmates to treat me like, right? And so Hannah went back to her class and immediately did that with those kids. And the other one was how I want my teacher to treat me. And so they're both up there. And then she pulls out some of the notes, as I'm, sure you advised, and talk to the kids about what kind of a community are we. So there's so much stuff in here that is certainly reading centered and thoughtfully constructed to help us have those conversations. But there's also practical things about management and organizing kids around a love of reading that is powerful as well. And Lester, I have one other question for you. I know that people say I'm not good at read aloud. Could you talk about like some of the, what are the like mistake people will say to me, I don't want to perform. And what are the kind of the mistakes we make when we read aloud to kids?
You want to contextualize that in
like
in
if
the
I go
world
to
of-
pick up a book and read it, like The Proudest Blue,
yeah.
one of the
Okay.
things, go ahead.
What I was wondering, and do you want to contextualize that in the world of tablets and iPhones, or do you want to just think about, like when I first started teaching, there were none of those things. So, if you wanted to engage kids in books, then you were the Madison Avenue. It was your voice that captured a rhythm and pulled kids in. It was your read aloud that allowed them to entertain the notion that the character should have different voices in your head, and that the tone of your voice and the pacing and the rise and the fall and the intensity of the volume should signal a shift in mood, or let you know that the writer has a little snark going on, that he's not being serious. And if you don't signify that with your voice, if you read everything as if you're Charlie Brown's teacher, then what they hear when they hear a story, it becomes this monotone something. Very often late at night, if I can't go to sleep, I listen to the BBC, because when they tell you the news, they just kind of lean in and whisper, and even the most horrible of awful things will put you to sleep because none of it is ever elevated. But when I'm reading a story, then I think there are 4 or 5 factors we have to do as read aloud. And those are tone, intensity, pacing, and mood. And so we have to understand the concept of tone and note that the writer wrote this with a particular tone. And if we don't interpret that, we can't deliver it. That the book at the end should evoke a certain mood. If we look through and read the story and we recognize this is a somber, quiet mood, then we're not going to read it in the big, joyful voice of, oh my gosh, on the second day, her cat died. That's not going to help us at all. And then I have to pay attention to intensity, like when I whisper and when my voice rises and when I just trail off into nothing and let there be dead space. Language to me is also musical. So if you have any background in music, the notion of time signature increases the speed of something. And that speed, generally the energy of that speed, signifies something in meaning. But so when we start reading a little faster, I hope that's because the tension's building, or because there's something we're moving toward, and a character would talk faster if they were excited. And if they're worried, they might speak a little slower and a little less loud. I want you to be able to pull that together. And then, as important as all of those things are, silence is also important in a read aloud. There are places where we just pause for 2 seconds to let them take something in, because there's a shift in the plot. And if you don't pause, they miss that shift. So I think now, the people who are concerned about performance, reading aloud to me is akin to storytelling, which is a performance art. And in the world we live in today, where children as young as 2 and 3 are in the shopping carts at the grocery store with a tablet, missing the opportunity to engage in all that environmental print, they're sitting here watching something. And for me to get you to want to sit and watch something that doesn't have animation, that doesn't have background music, that you can't touch and stretch and shrink, I've got to do something. And so it has to be your voice. I once heard Captain Kangaroo, and for all you young people in the audience, look
I
that
know
up.
him.
I once heard Captain Kangaroo when he was out of costume. He was just Bob Keesham, giving a speech at an early childhood conference. And at first I didn't want to go. I thought, what does he know? But I listened to him. And one of the things he was saying to early childhood teachers and to parents was, read aloud often with your children. Make a routine out of it, even if it's the same 5 books over and over. If you don't have money to buy books and you can't get to the library, read the same thing over and over, because it really isn't about the book. It's about your voice. And the idea that one person in my life is willing to give me undivided, no competition attention for the duration of this book. And it is the greatest gift an adult can give to a child, is to be 100% fully present. And that has stuck with me for 40 years. And I think about read aloud as a place where the person reading the book is totally devoted to delivering that story to an audience, whether it's an audience of 1 or 100,000. The singular focus is the audience and the story. And that's a powerful bond between book, reader, and those being read to. And, we're trying to engage kids in literacy. Our practices, no matter what we do, no matter how the philosophical wheel turns, no matter what the method du jour is, must include reading aloud. And you better damn well do it good.
And I think that devotion and that passion for a particular book only comes if you know the book, if you've read the text beforehand, if you've engaged with it. And I think that's where, I see a lot of my students, for instance, who do a read aloud and it doesn't quite work out the way they had imagined. And, when I ask them, well, what did you do when you sort of spent time with the book? How did you feel about it? Kind of thing. And, some of the, well, I kind of just found it on the way in to the classroom, and that doesn't work.
Yeah, and building off of that, here's a little card, and I keep it inside the Proudest Blue. It is the name of the 2 characters and the author's name, and there's a pronunciation key next to it, so that I don't look at it and forget how you say it. That if I want you to honor other people's names, then I need to make sure that when I read the characters' names, I get them right. Because once you hear them, if you're a listener, when you see that name in the book, what you pull up is what I said. And if I say it wrong, you're not going to sit there at that name and try sounding it out. You're going to look at the name and go, oh, that's what he just said. So, I just leave it here. And those are the 3 names on here, and I gave myself the pronunciation. And for those of you who are not comfortable with names that you don't recognize, there's a little feature on your phone under Google called Pronounce This Name. And it will not only say it for you, it will spell it phonetically so you can remember it. And so there's no excuse for us to go into a book and not know. And then there's a place in this book, for example, in the Proudest Blue, where the speech comes first. And then at the end, it says, she whispered. Well, if you've never read this book before, you're going to say that dialogue out loud in a normal voice and then realize, oh, she whispered. So you have to back it up. Well, you've already put it in their head now. You've already made that deposit and you can't withdraw it. It's already there. So you have to read ahead of time to know where the taglines are going to signify those shifts that won't come ahead. So Vivian is absolutely right. We have to rehearse this the same way we would rehearse any other performance.
I
Wow.
want to say again, ditto, 12th grade. Same thing in 12th grade. It's a I think teachers should read to AP classes or IB classes, right?
I agree.
The kids need to hear it. And one of Penny and our favorite prompt is have kids pick a passage and we ask them to read this the way the author intended it to be read, right? Because that's literary analysis, right? They have to think about that comma. They have to think about, it's a whisper.
And we have them record it and then send it to us. And part of what you're doing is just getting kids to honor the sound of the text. And, I spent a lot of time traveling with Kelly, and I'll never forget us racing through an airport where he was reciting passages from Hamlet, right? You kind of lose it at some point. But I told him as I was going along in we were on one of those moving things, I would have really paid attention to Hamlet if I heard it read like that.
Yeah.
Right? There is something really powerful about our own willingness to engage and think about that text, because someone is delivering it to us like it's precious and important. And the meaning is in how you say it.
Well, if you notice, almost everything we lay out in this book is a read aloud.
Mm-hmm.
The presentation of the books, the movie read, the reading with the text, the reading against the text, all the lessons are centered around a read aloud.
Yeah.
The idea that you've got to learn to process this before you go apply it someplace. And I would also say, as far as I know, there's no measure of what something sounds like in the head of a reader when they read silently. There's no way to check that out. But I am pretty convinced that the model of what they hear inside their head mirrors what it sounds like when they read aloud.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And, if what they read aloud sounds the way you, Penny, were hearing Hamlet, earlier before Kelly, it's like, okay, gee, where is the model for how you heard Hamlet coming from? Probably high school, when you heard Hamlet the first time and somebody's reading it like a lesson and not like a performance. And as a result, you hear it like a lesson. So when you read it, you replicate that rhythm and that pacing and that intonation, because you're looking for the lesson, not for the play. And so if someone had read it to you like that, and so the value to me of that for us reading aloud to kids in multiple genres and multiple forms, poetry, riddles, jokes, nonfiction, my nonfiction go-to voice is the narrator on Shark Week of the Discovery Channel. The great warm weather, the great white swim in the warm tepid water off the coast. The great
That is funny.
Well, the voice is kind of quiet because he's not trying to overshadow the information. And there are pauses between concepts so that you can listen. And if you listen to the narrator in there, you think, wow, this is brilliant. And then you listen to the guy who reads Harry Potter, the narrator on the Harry Potter tapes, and the voices, pacing, and the shifting between characters. It's a very different thing. I'd love to hear that narrator read the script for Shark Week, just to see what he does as he shifts between fiction and nonfiction.
Well, the first ones we bought were the ones from the British guy who does them. 125 voices he did for the first book. And we used to listen to those when we go on these long cross-country trips to see grandparents. It's truly a gift to give that to kids, and what an absence if they don't have it. I hope that this becomes something that many people are using in classrooms, not just practicing teachers, but pre-service programs where teachers are learning how to do this before they walk into classrooms. It's just really powerful. And I thank you so much for all the work that went into making it, which leads me to the last question, right, Kelly?
If you want, we're pretty long.
I know. We'll make it quick.
So question is, we love to ask the people we talk to, what are you reading now? What's on your plate?
Got a stack of books. I'm designing a new course for the fall, so there's a stack of 10 books over there, but one of them is Goldie Muhammad's Unearthing Joy, professional books. And then a student just recommended what I like to call my beach read. So he recommended Red, White, and Royal Blue. It's a romance novel of about the president of the United States, a female president of the United States, her son, and his romantic endeavors with the Prince of England. So that's kind of fun, very light read. And I read lots of things at the same time. Barracoon by Zora Neale Hurston. It's the story of, in 1927, I think, she interviewed the last survivor of Cotilda, which was the last known U.S. slave ship they found in Alabama. And so my mom bought me that book years ago for Christmas, and it's been sitting there. And then recently I watched Descendant on Netflix, which is the story of the Cotilda, which inspired me to finally pick up Barracoon. So it takes me a while to read things because I'm reading multiple things at once.
Very
Vivian,
cool.
what's on your plate?
Right now I'm reading How to Be a Young Anti-Racist by Kendi and Stone. And Kendi's work on racism is so powerful. And so I'm, really interested to see how he goes about framing work that he's done with adults for younger children. And then the other book that I'm reading right now is Local by Jessica Machado. And it's a memoir, and the author struggles to sort out what it means to be local to her native Hawaii versus, how tourists define and construct Hawaii. So I'm interested in how she navigates that space of being in between, because I've often sort of felt that in betweenness. So yeah, so those are the two right now that are on the go.
Mr. Lamanik?
I'm playing with Murder Your Darlings by Roy Peter Clark.
Yes.
I love his work, and I spot read this. I used to be one of those people who would just go right to the edge of the water and then wade out and frolic in the first chapter or two, and then just dive in and stay in the water until the book was done. And, the older I get, I'm more like a kid in a wading pool. I kind of get in, get refreshed, get out, get dried off, get back in. So this book, I read in bits and pieces, and it stays on the table in front of my chair. Because it's National Poetry Month, I'm going back through an old favorite. I love Mary Oliver, and I have all kinds of collections of hers, but I love this collection called Devotions that just pulls from different collections and has a few pieces in it. And then my reading addiction is fed by a drug dealer called NPR. And they do these really amazing book reviews. They could make toilet paper sound like the thing you've got to read this afternoon. And so you do that one-click thing instead of going to your local bookstore. So don't tell Chris I didn't buy this book from him. But I am just started this called The Queen of Dirt Island. It is written by an Irish writer named Donald Ryan, and it is a fictional piece, but it's based a lot on the women in his life. And so it reads like a memoir with four people, and it's really funny because the title of the first chapter is End. And so it begins with the ending of something for one of those people, and then the story unfolds. And then it ends with the beginning. So, and I'm just getting into it, but I really like his language.
What a rich discussion we have had today.
I know. Oh my gosh.
Just the book recommendations alone, or just the segment on the read aloud alone, or the segment on your book, this idea, and I think it was Vivian who said that, and I love this idea that no texts are neutral. Right. And I was listening to that through the lens of, I was a journalism major in college, and I was taught to be neutral, which now looking back at that is ludicrous. But just again, I love the conversation today. I love the ideas of teaching young kids to read critically. And, this is a compliment. Normally we cut this at about 25 minutes and we kept going because it was great. So
really
thank you all
great.
for giving up your time today.
Thank you so much.
It's a pleasure always to be with you guys.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for having us.
Absolutely. Thank you.